Hi, my name is Tatiana, and I'm going to talk a little about Beowulf. I'll start with a little introduction, then give you a brief synopsis of the epic poem, after which I'll talk about its diction and its structure. In the end, I'll give you my short conclusion and my sources. So, first of all, you probably know that Beowulf is the most famous English epic poem. It's not particularly long. It consists of only 3,182 lines, and for comparison, Iliad is over 15,000 lines and the Odyssey is over 12,000 lines. Beowulf is attributed to an anonymous author who is usually referred to as Beowulf Poet. And the exact date when the manuscript was written isn't known, but it's estimated that this happened between year 975 and year 1025. This, however, is only the date when the manuscript was created. It's not when the epic poem was composed, as it is generally believed that the epic existed before as part of the Germanic oral storytelling tradition. So, what happens in it? First, we see Hrothgar, king of the Danes, in what we would today call Denmark, who celebrates with his warriors in the mead hall that he has built and that he calls Herald. They are attacked by a troll-like creature called Grendel, and Beowulf, a warrior from Geatland, so he's not one of the Danes, he's a Geat or a Goth, as we would say today. He hears about those events and sets out from his homeland to help Hrothgar. He arrives and soon fights Grendel with his bare hands and actually tears his arm off. Later they celebrate and drink and sleep at Herod, but in the night they are attacked by Grendel's mother, who is rather upset about the events. She kills Ashura, who is one of the most loyal warriors of King Hrothgar, and later she escapes into her lair under a lake. Beowulf then goes into this lair and fights Grendel's mother. He kills her and goes a little bit further into the cave, where he finds Grendel's corpse and cuts off his head. Later he comes back to the surface and the men celebrate his victory. Beowulf then returns home to Geatland and soon becomes king of the Geats. About 50 years later, a dragon attacks his land, and Beowulf tells his men to retreat and that he will fight this dragon alone as a true hero. Only one of the warriors, called Wiglaf, insists on coming with Beowulf. All the others run and hide. So together Beowulf and Wiglaf fight the dragon, and Beowulf kills it, but he's mortally wounded in this fight and soon dies. And in the end we see Wiglaf with the other warriors mourn Beowulf and perform a grand funeral for him. Now let's look at the diction, at how Beowulf is written. We call this an epic poem, but to be honest, it bears very little resemblance to the poetry we know today. First of all, there is very little use of rhyme, almost none of it. And in addition, there is inconsistent rhythm. That means that the number of syllables in each line may vary. The primary poetic device is alliteration, meaning that you have a lot of words beginning with the same sound close to each other. Another feature of it is that each line has two halves separated by a caesura, or a pause, a break in the middle. But on both sides of the caesura we have stressed syllables containing similar sounds. And I've mentioned briefly that Beowulf most likely belonged to an oral tradition before it was written down, and as you can imagine, telling a long epic poem from memory is quite a task. The poet had to speak continuously and fluidly, without hesitations, without self-corrections, without unnecessary pauses, etc. I know I'm struggling with it right now, and I don't even have to speak in dactylic hexameter or use alliteration all the time. So to make the poet's life easier, the epics had a clever little trick up their sleeve. In ancient Greek poetry, we see recurring epithets, while in Germanic tradition, keenings fulfill the same function. Keenings are compound expressions with metaphorical meanings. So the difference between these two devices is that epithets in Greek epics are used in combination with a noun. They describe it and specify it. But a kenning, in the Germanic tradition is a compound expression that is used instead of the noun. So, for instance, the Homeric poet would frequently mention ships, right? But each time he would have a lot of different ways that he could refer to a ship. It could be a swift ship, or it could be a black ship, it could be a hollow ship, or a ship with good benches, or a ship with oars, etc., etc. The poet would normally choose an epithet not based on meaning, but on prosody, because meaning is not particularly relevant, as any ship could be referred to in this way, because all ships were normally black and hollow, and they all had benches, they all had oars. So the important thing was how many syllables were needed in this line. In one instance, he could use a short 2-syllable epithet, and in another instance, he could pick a longer 6-syllable epithet. In Germanic tradition, we've just said that the poetic meter wasn't as important, but the important part was alliteration. So let's say Beowulf poet is talking about shields, and he does this very often. He would learn some kennings for it, and here we have 17 of them, I believe. And by the way, if you're wondering about the letters in the parentheses, those are the case and number of those nouns. So then, in a line where the letter L is predominant, Beowulf poet could use the word lind to mean shield. And in another case, he might say bored or rond or skilled. And even though we've said meter is not super crucial for Germanic epics, the lines are still of more or less equal length. So he could choose a short or long kenning, depending on which would fit better in each particular case. Now let's look at the structure. The most prominent feature of the structure is the ring composition. What this means is that in a particular fragment we might find a kernel in the middle, and the lines surrounding this kernel are in a way mirroring each other. That is, the first line is mirrored in the last, the second is reflected in the penultimate, etc. So you get a structure like ABCXCBA, or it could be longer, ABCDXDCBA, or even longer than that. You get the picture. We can find an example of such structure on the very first page of Beowulf. I'm not going to torture you with my Old English pronunciation, so let's get straight to the translation. To him in time a son was born, young in the land, whom God sent as a comfort to the people. He understood the dire need they had suffered earlier, lacking a king for a long time. Therefore the Lord of life, ruler of glory, granted them worldly grace. Beowulf was famous, his name ran widely, skilled son in the lands of the north. It may not be obvious at first, but if you read it closely, you can see that both the first and the last line mention the son of skilled. In the first we have, to him in time a son was born. Him in this case refers to skilled, who was mentioned just before it. And the last line has skilled son. The second line provides a description of Beowulf. He is young. And in the penultimate line we have a characterization of Beowulf again. Beowulf was famous, his name ran widely. In the third line we have God sending him as a comfort to the people. And in the third from the bottom, God is granting them worldly grace. So he's blessing the people with Beowulf. And finally, in the middle, we find our colonel, the Danes' long years of misfortune after their king had died. But this was just a little excerpt of 8 lines. How about larger chunks? Well, we do find ring composition throughout the text and on a larger scale as well. Here, for instance, we have the representation of the central episode, Beowulf's fight against Grendel's mother, or his dam, as Broder refers to her here. You can see that this is a far more complex and far longer structure, but there is a lot of mirroring happening here too. Some of it, you might say, is just perfectly logical. Like, of course, if the lair of Grendel's mother is under a lake, then the hero will first travel to the lake, descend through the waters into the cave, and then later he'll go back up to the surface and back to the meat hole where he came from. That's just common sense. There's nothing very special about it, right? But the consistency with which this mirroring technique is used and the level of detail that we find in Beowulf can hardly be a coincidence. So, for example, this episode begins and ends at night. There are speeches given at the beginning and at the end. And notice also how the order of speakers is reversed. And even some little details are reflected, like on the journey to the lake, they see Ashura's cut-off head, and after the fight, Beowulf emerges with Grendel's cut-off head. Another curious detail in Beowulf is that the poet often reflects the events with a different mood, with a different emotional coloring. So the night before the fight is violent, and the night after is peaceful and uneventful. On the way to the lake, the landscape is described as an unknown path, but on the way back, the poet calls it the known ways. Or the farewell that Beowulf gives to Hrothgar before descending into the lake. It is serious or even somber, but afterwards the greeting is joyous and full of celebration. In addition, you might also have noticed that the overall narrative kind of resembles the hero's journey scheme that you maybe remember from Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces. And this particular fight here would represent the abyss phase in the hero's journey. The moment when the hero goes into the belly of the whale and experiences a death and rebirth. In Beowulf, this death and rebirth is particularly noticeable because the warriors waiting for him on the shore see the pool fill with blood, and they believe it's his blood and think him a dead man, basically. But then Beowulf emerges from the cleansed waters, safe and sound, in a moment of metaphorical rebirth. And even if we look at the overall structure, it's not really a perfect mirroring, but you can see some elements of it. So the prologue, for instance, begins with a description of a king's funeral, and in the epilogue we see King Beowulf's funeral. We have 3 fights, the one in the middle, which is the one we've just discussed, could be considered the kernel, and it is surrounded on both sides with great banquets and celebrations of Beowulf's heroics. And next in line would be the 2 other fights, reflecting each other but differing in mood. The first fight is with a very young Beowulf slaying his very first monster, while the last sees the old battle-worn King Beowulf defeat a drake, but pay with his life for this victory. All in all, we could say that the diction in Beowulf and its use of kennings point to the epic being rather formulaic, albeit less so than such ancient Greek epics as the Iliad or the Odyssey. Homer uses a far greater number of epithets, and in Beowulf we have a lot fewer kennings, which may signify that the genre of epic poem was in an earlier stage of development in the Germanic tradition, but this also may simply be because this work is much shorter than either of the ancient Greek examples. We can also conclude that that Beowulf poet had a keen sense of narrative, demonstrated by his use of the ring composition and the hero journey structure. And in addition, I find it interesting to note his philosophy being shown in Beowulf. Here, human success and failure are an inseparable pair. There's never joy that's too far away from sorrow, and creation is never too far apart from dissolution or destruction. This may be interpreted as a very fatalistic view, but then maybe the Beowulf poet is just being a realist and someone who understands that both of those are in balance. So this is it. That's all I had time for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something new. And if you're curious, here are the sources I've used. Thanks for watching, and see you later.